Before I started seminary, I was in Montana at St. Peter's Cathedral. This is where my mentor, this is where she was serving as dean at the time, and so I went out there for a year to work under her at the cathedral. Now, St. Peter's is like Resurrection in that they also have a Wednesday service. But their Wednesday service is in the morning. And so there's a little coffee hour afterwards. And I want to say it's about a month that this went on. I'm hoping that it wasn't much more than that. But I would go there and I would stay. And I'd stay till pretty much everyone had left. Just because I thought it would be a nice, hospitable thing to do, to be with them. Now, I noticed, but I didn't think much of it, that my mentor, Heidi, did not stick around for this. That she would be there for a little bit, and then she'd go back to her office to get her other work done. Well, then one week, and again, I don't think it was quite a month, at least I hope it wasn't, but it could have been. I was there, and there were these two wonderful ladies who were always the last ones to leave. And they stayed, everybody else had left, and they stayed. And they stayed. And they stayed. And I stayed with them. And pretty soon, the morning got a little bit closer to noon. And around this time was when we were doing our stewardship campaign at St. Peter's. So that's a reminder, if there's still something y'all need to do for your own stewardship, this is my little plug to keep that in mind. But we were meeting with the stewardship committee about drafting a letter to send out to the congregation. So that was pretty much immediately after everyone left. So I didn't get a chance to actually eat anything. So this meeting with the stewardship committee and with Heidi goes on for about an hour, maybe. And so by the time it's done, we're well into noon. Well past noon, even. So I thought I was doing something really good and trying to be hospitable to these wonderful ladies. But doing so actually meant that I was not doing what I needed to for my own well-being and my own health, which didn't help me and frankly didn't help anybody else. So right after this meeting, I turned to Heidi and I said, I got to stop staying for this coffee hour. I got to stop staying for the whole thing. And she looks at me and kind of smiles and says, wondered how long it would take you to figure that out. So again, I don't know quite how long this was. I hope, in my mind, it was just a couple of weeks. I think it was closer to a month. Kind of hope that I'm right, because it seems a little less embarrassing for me. But I turned to Heidi, and I'm like kind of shocked, and I say to her, why didn't you say something to me? And the word she says was basically, because if I'd said something to you, you wouldn't have taken it seriously. There's some things you just got to learn on your own. And that's a good reminder for us in life. It's a good reminder for those of us who serve in ministry that, yeah, sometimes you've got to experience these things for yourself. Sometimes you've got to have these embarrassing moments. Sometimes you even have to fail to really learn this lesson, for it to really sink in. That really connects with what we hear this morning, in our psalm in particular, in Psalm 81. And particularly one verse in it. because we hear that when the Israelites wouldn't listen, that God gave them over to the stubbornness of their hearts to follow their own devices. Now, in the Old Testament, what we often see, what we often hear, the Old Testament or the Tanakh, as the Hebrews would call it, is we get God hardening the hearts of, say, Pharaoh or somebody else so that they're not going to listen. And part of where that comes from is the Hebrew understanding that God is in complete control. So when we hear those words, that's really what's going on. But what the Old Testament is really showing us is what we just heard in this song. What the Old Testament is really saying, it can be summed up in this song. That when we, in our stubbornness, fail to listen to God, God lets us along that path. God lets us do what we want to do. Because God is like a good parent or a good mentor who lets us do as we will. When we don't listen to God, God's not going to stop us from going on that other path. What the Tanakh or the Old Testament also is God's cry to us in those moments. What we often hear in the Old Testament, particularly in Torah, is how we are supposed to live in this life. And we're not talking about fire and brimstone or God, what God's going to do to us if we don't listen to what God says. No, what God is doing is trying to help us to follow the right path for ourselves. What God is actually saying to us is, hey, if you don't stop doing these bad things that you're doing, bad things are going to happen. I'm trying to help you out here, guys. I'm trying to help you to live in the best way possible for you. We should also remember that the Old Testament is not the only part of the Bible that gives us examples for how to live our lives. We heard this in our New Testament readings this morning. In Hebrews, we're told to have hospitality for the stranger, which is what we hear oftentimes in the Tanakh. We're called in Hebrews to help those in prison, as Jesus tells others in Matthew's Gospel. We're called in Hebrews to live in right relationship, particularly in our marriages. And we're called, as we've heard a great deal in our readings this summer, particularly in Luke, to not live a greedy life. In Luke, Jesus calls us to be humble in how we interact with others and how we show ourselves in the world. Jesus also calls us to give generously, and not in sort of a quid pro quo, if I can get those words out, type of way. We're not giving out of an expectation of receiving something back. We don't receive even with the expectation of always being able to give something back. We're called to be generous out of love, out of generosity's sake. Now, all these things, all these guidelines that were given in both the Old and the New Testaments, they can help us. They can help us to live as a better, and a more just society, as many would say and many would like for us to remember. But the key there is we've got to actually listen to what's being suggested. If we listen, then yeah, we can live a better life for ourselves and with one another. And if not, we won't. God's call for us is to listen. And that's the hope, that we will listen. Because God is a good parent or a good mentor for us. God's not going to sit there and cause us to do this or that. God's not going to lead us into evil. But God is going to try to help us. God is going to shout out to us what we need to do. But when we don't listen, God is a good enough parent, a good enough mentor to let us follow on our own way. So instead of following in our own path, let's stop and listen. Stop and listen and try to have a better sense of what it is that God is telling us. No, God's not going to stop us when we go our own way. But, and this is the hope for us, God will be there as a good parent, as a good mentor, to help pick us back up when we do fall.